Welcome to Global Sourcing Insights from SIPS. Today's focus is on how can technology help procurement in a downturn. This edition is a co-production of SIPS Americas and Spend Matters. Our guest today is Pierre Mitchell. He's the Managing Director and Chief Research Officer at Spend Matters. He leads CPO-driven research and IP development at Spend Matters and is the chief architect of the firm's industry-leading Solution Map framework. So welcome, Pierre. How are you?
Thanks, Bob. I'm great. Thanks for having me today. Really looking forward to spending some time with you and the audience here.
Excellent. So manufacturing PMIs are down right now, suggesting we have a contraction ahead in the US and Canada at least. But inflation is also down a notch. The job market is tight. So maybe we aren't about to head off of a cliff. But even so, there's likely still potholes ahead of us. And that will be probably largely dependent on your organization and your sector in the market. So let's start and run a quick poll. It looks like the big worry is doing more with less as organizational budgets shrink. Okay? So let's make sure we get to that one. That's a big one. The next one on our list, the next most popular would be keeping suppliers healthy. So that is a big concern. And then our third, it would be forecasting demand in potentially shrinking markets. So I know that you've got tools that you have that you're going to talk about in that area. So those are the big three right now. So thank you very much, everyone, for participating in the poll. So now, what are those the key challenges, and where do we start here?
Well, I think probably what I'll do is with some of the questions that whichever questions you want to kind of go with, I'll probably just start a little bit on strategy and process, and then transition to kind of the tool, the digital support piece of it. And I think that piece around doing more with less is a constant theme because there's so much to do in supply management and so many opportunities. It's like, how do you prioritize, right? That, and everything has an economic cost. So, if you're going to kind of start, a good place is to start, where stakeholders have a need, which we can kind of talk about in terms of, needing to fill talent or finding materials that we're not able to find right now, or, et cetera. But having that first principle of knowing what supply markets can offer up, and so this can take lots of different, forms. So first, obviously in terms of just suppliers, there are tools for supplier discovery and, things like that. And we can do a deep dive on that stuff kind of a little bit later. But, a lot of it kind of ties to the budgets, right? And lack thereof, and not just procurement, but the business overall, right? And whereas if we're kind of in a period of mixed stagflation, if you will, it's trying to take a look at where the money is going to come from, both, on the revenue side and kind of the cost implications. And so one of the places I'd kind of start with is kind of what I call big spend management, not just supplier spending, but, in terms of where finance is working with the business and, hey, let's look at how much budget we have. Are the budgets cut? How much do we have left? What are we still trying to accomplish, as a business? And given kind of those goals and some of the limited resources that we have, both in terms of budget and people, how do we close that gap, right? And I think that's where procurement can be really helpful in terms of trying to understand where, markets can help. So for example, if you have some talent shortages, maybe you're looking for just, the perfect candidates to fill. But in the meantime, if you really need to get those, resources, this is where, contingent staffing types of models can help, MSPs or freelancer sites or lots of different things like that. These are very useful options to consider, and a way to test bed some new models if you haven't done that, as well as just, when you look at providers and tools in this area, let's say, rate benchmarking, to be like, hey, we can get some of those similar skills, but for 1/3 the cost that we pay in a full-time hire. Maybe we can look at this new model. And if you use a provider that can do that rate benchmarking, then you can also maybe use them in some of your traditional kind of staff aug programs or things like that, and take your role and skill definition, some of the things that, SIPS does really granularly in the procurement profession and the supply management, being able to do that with all the business and really try to understand where the market can help in providing, better, faster, cheaper sets of resources. So
it sounds like Yeah, well, it sounds like the first thing you got to do is round up your stakeholders and really kind of decide, okay, what's most important to the business, because the I guess the it's easy to just hear from a senior executive, well, cut 10%, cut X or whatever,
Right.
and
Right.
then say and come up with a plan. Well, you can't do that without really listening to everybody who's all in the same boat and say, okay, which products? I guess the answer is then which products are we not going to sell? Or are we going to cut back on, or not, or prioritize lower in our whole value chain? So it really it starts with a really frank discussion. You can't just come up with this stuff out of nowhere.
Correct. Absolutely. Supply management starts with stakeholder management and demand management, and then you work backwards, right? From demand, to supply.
Yep. So you there are people who can help you in sort of the budgeting and manage some of that now, but also in your downturn, one of the key things is not to get caught and to look at not just your current spending and your current demand models or whatever, but also the future. So what kind of help can we get there in just looking ahead beyond tomorrow or today's fire?
Absolutely. Well, if you think about just economics 101, the idea of cost and sunk costs, which you've already made those decisions, the money's been spent, right? And versus economic costs. What are the things that you can still change, right? And when you're doing, I call it spent analysis, the transactional history, that's fine to give you a view into how much you have spent. And that can be a very useful predictor for future spending that you can kind of get ahead of. So if you take a spend cube, which is your spending by supplier and by spend category and by cost center, those three kind of key variables, that's great for historic spending. But when you now project forward, you don't necessarily what that's going to be by spend category. You can kind of see things through the lens of the budget. So one of the key things here is kind of engage with finance in the FP&A, which is financial planning analysis or budgeting process, and even kind of mid-year, and be able to be like understanding, what spend is left and what you're trying to accomplish. Because it's actually interesting, think about the worst practice of, use it or lose it budgeting. Let's spend all the money at the end of the year, so we've earned the right to spend more money next year. That doesn't kind of feel right as a good way to kind of save money, right? So there's this whole area around zero-based budgeting, and that can get all fancy ways of doing this. But the net of it is, how can you actually go and look at that spend before it's going to occur? And one of the ways that you can do that is not just through some of the budgeting tools, and there are specific, procurement solutions that have kind of keyed off of that and, be able to kind of align to that. And obviously your purchase to pay systems, have this ability hopefully to do budget lookups and, hey, do I still have money to spend, et cetera. But this means things like planning renewals. So contract renewals, those things are taking more and more bandwidth as we move to, let's say, software spending and SaaS and everything. Everything's becoming kind of a subscription based, kind of evergreen types of spending. In that case, you better have some good visibility into your contracts, right? In terms of not just the renewal dates, but notification periods and kind of backward scheduling. Because, if you're going to be doing a Salesforce renewal or, something else where you need like 6-9 months at least to really prepare for a negotiation for a major upgrade or something like that, you need to get your ducks in order and you need to plan for that. And you don't want to be rushing at the last minute, right? So you want to be planning your workload. And the way to plan your workload is certainly working with your stakeholders, working with IT and their project portfolio, looking through the budgets, looking through the renewals that are coming up, and trying to then figure out where do we best spend our time. And if you don't have enough time to do it in procurement, this is where, there are managed services, the MSP type models. There are different types of service models where you can take a whole category spend and give it to another provider, like in terms of like a contingency based sourcing, or just could be staff log, could be just that SaaS spending. There's lots of good providers out there that will just be like, just like with your telecom bill at home, just, you can contact companies and they're like, we will guarantee you, we will just reduce the amount of money that you pay and we take a cut of the the benefits. So there are a lot of these types of providers. Some of them are actually software slash services hybrids, and they're a way to kind of fund the ability to do this kind of SaaS spend management tools. And then there are kind of just larger service providers like NPI, and there's others that are kind of, they just, this is kind of like their core, what they do for a living. So anyway, always, and when you're doing this, always a good time to just, get rid of unneeded licenses and demand management and reduce, where you really don't need to be spending money just in case. This is not a great time to, have needless spending, right? So by getting ahead of it and by engaging with your stakeholders early and by getting better visibility and planning tools, you can then kind of then dive into, okay, great. How much can we save either on, the rate side or the volume side, or get more value from the vendors on other types of performance, things to drive revenue uplift and whatever. So anyway.
Excellent. Well, and in a time when interest rates are jumping or creeping upwards, depending on how you think about it, I remember the days of 13% mortgage rates, so 7% sounds like a bargain to me. But companies in these situations are trying to preserve cash. So is there help in that regard? I mean, are there vendors out there who can do things that are really valuable, and not just sort of window dressing or things that you could do yourself, that really add value?
Yeah, I would just kind of start with, the principles and kind of, Willie Sutton, go to the banks. That's where the money is, right? I mean, kind of start with some of your own tools to identify where the cash is, particularly around the working capital side, raw material inventory, as well as obviously on the DPO side. I mean, there might even be some DSO opportunities with the sell side, but working with sales and marketing. But in terms of cash preservation, there's a lot that you can do with just some of your existing tools, assuming you have some decent spend analysis tools, you have basic contract data. You can start looking at spend analytics and contract analytics and start to work with finance, with treasury, and be like, we can get a good estimate of some level of cash flow planning in terms of when we're expected to be paying suppliers and money, going out the door. And not only can you do that, but if you have, visibility into the terms, and you want to be able to maybe, if you're in a good position to have a decent cash position, you can take those early pay discounts. You can get really good payback on that. You can also get some intelligence from suppliers where if you make them some very aggressive early payment discount terms and they're taking the money, that says, well, gosh, they're really desperate for cash. You may want to double click on that and understand what's going on there. So you can actually get some intelligence there, as well. And then there's, certainly both tools and service offerings out there in terms of, working capital and namely around supply chain financing, like, even SAP, they get into the game. They bought Talia, big, working capital kind of payments company. And, really trying to look at not just, the workflow automation, but let's follow the money and see how we can better manage that cash. And so you can definitely use some of the systems that you have and then bring in some of the specialized kind of analytics tools and things like that to, see if you can take some of the money that's on the table there for you. Yeah.
So you mentioned the suppliers who are taking advantage of early payment terms, and that might be a little a yellow flag or a yellow light or something, a little warning sign. So what about this worry about keeping suppliers in business? I mean, if they fail, you're in deep trouble, especially if they are strategic suppliers. So how do you keep tabs on them and get to know their health without being too intrusive, or they walk away from you because you want to know too much?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. This area around supplier management, and whether you call it supplier relationship management or whatever, third party management, whatever you want to call it. But I think one of the most important things here is that you got to be smart in how you manage your supply base, because you can't be getting up, close and personal and going deep with, 10,000 suppliers, right? You have to figure out how to segment them. and how to manage them. And primarily that's going to be done around spend and risk and impact and a lot of these key segmentations. So I think the biggest thing is, making sure that you have some good discipline and segmenting around those suppliers and being able to identify the ones that are, say, have the highest impact on the business, which is not necessarily cost, but this key components or materials that are used in, let's say, goods that represent 50% of your revenues, right? That you're selling. That's kind of where supply chain risk analysis and supplier risk analysis, as well as where can some of these innovative suppliers work with you to develop new products and services, maybe more cost-effective ones in a downturn, more things where you're doing digital transformation stuff, you're trying to move to more services revenue or, things like that, right? So if you do that, you got to be smart in how you engage these suppliers and figure out where you're going to try to do some scans, let's say on the financial risk piece itself. So you might be like, all right, I want to look at the ones that impact a lot of revenue and ones maybe that are private and there's not a lot of transparency. And there I might want to bring in a specialized, supplier risk, financial risk assessment, tool, right? It could.
So there are technology tools that can help you in these things.
Yeah, they're hybrids usually. It's kind of technology and kind of some type of benchmarking or services. So, everyone's familiar with Dun & Bradstreet, right? And that kind of
Sure.
Approach, but there are more fine-grained ones. It could be, rapid ratings for private suppliers. They have a whole methodology there around analyzing them, which is actually, it's just good old-fashioned, balance sheet analysis and business analysis. And there's just a whole solid methodology behind it, which is a great way to learn about financial planning and, business assessment by using some of these tools, as well as, of course, getting a score on those suppliers. And there's a whole methodology of doing that. And this is just one supplier, but there's a lot of these types of tools that are out there that can help you assess supply chain risk that's out there, not just supplier risk. And depending on risk type and different things, there's a whole, huge market of folks that are out there. And you might want to use them to understand real risk. And oh, by the way, see how well the suppliers are complying with the regulatory stuff around ESG, right? So that way you can be like, all right, I'm looking at the check the box regulatory compliance and supplier compliance, customer compliance, but I'm also looking at real risk and seeing where there's some, some things that I need to take a look at it and being smart about that, because you can't just grind all your suppliers through some giant, risk assessment profile, especially if you're a small company, you don't have smaller company, you don't have a lot of budget.
Yep. So you have mentioned operationalizing supply risk. I have no idea what that means, but it sounds like it could be important.
Well, operationalizing is one of those consultees words that you have to use, multisyllabic words that, really make you sound smart, so.
Okay, well, make me sound smart then, okay?
Hey, you have to battle. You pronounced it correctly, Bob.
All right.
So we're good. No, this just talks about, a lot of folks think about supply risk and supply chain risk often very strategically, but often very reactively and in a project-based way. So think about, from the pandemic and how the sins that it exposed in our global supply chains, right? And the types of risks that we face there. And you can't just continue to play reactive supply chain risk whack-a-mole, right? At some point, you have to kind of operationalize how you do supply risk, let's say within the sourcing process, and how we score suppliers on risk as part of a formal evaluative criteria, not just as some knockout thing in the RFI round, right? You actually evaluate folks on this. So as you get into kind of steady state management of risk as just part of how you do supply management, and you bake that into existing processes, that also includes like supply chain execution and inbound, and just, if you are building some, manufacturing, you're building some assembly and it's got lots of components, and there's that one key component that like you're waiting on that's sitting out somewhere on a boat or a plane or some in China in a COVID lockdown, you got to make some decisions, right? It's like, first of all, when is it really going to get here? And then if it's not here, what are my options, right? Are there substitutes? Or if you have to actually switch over and run something completely different, how do you do some fast planning? How do you do that? So now you're kind of mashing up kind of supply risk kind of insights with production planning and supply planning and supplier planning and some of these different areas. So it really just, there are tools that can kind of just help you in terms of just think of an example. And so like SourceDay is an interesting vendor. This is like, my first job out of school was kind of doing production planning and kind of buyer planner role. And this is a tool to really help manage the collaboration with suppliers and buyers when you're getting these signals coming out of the ERP or supply chain systems, and basically orchestrating that and just making sure supplier, you got this, you got the commitment, basically making sure and automating these signals. And if you're not actually hearing from the supplier tells you something's going to be late, it gets into that, well, what now, what if analysis, so I can actually be proactive and respond quickly versus, hey, where's that part? We're about to run that lot on the line. Oh, it's not here. And then, heck breaks loose, right? So it's these types of tools that can help, operationalize, deal with the operational concerns of supply chain risk and supplier risk.
So this is baking in the whole risk questions as you're developing a product or on a whole new sourcing project, is to bake it right in. It's like actually talking to the lawyers before you sign the contract, kind of thing. It's like, get the risk management before you actually commit. Sounds like it's forward planning.
Or like what stakeholders do when they're like, hey, we've got this great supplier we want to work with, and we're just hoping you can, get your 5% savings. And you're like, no, that's not the way to run the business.
Okay. So now another thing that I think you've talked about is basically outsourcing. Managing things like IT, finance, HR, marketing, and supply chain management. So is that like, is it essentially outsourcing your outsourcing? Or outsourcing your sourcing, not outsourcing your outsourcing.
Well, yeah.
Outsourcing your sourcing.
Well, you never want to outsourcing really strategic sourcing, but I would say that there is this idea, and actually it's interesting. There's a large global entertainment brand. I just won't mention their name, but they're actually, I think, at an ISM conference. But anyway, the procurement organization worked with stakeholders, and when stakeholders were like, I have this problem, I just want to be able to get rid of it. I want to be able to have someone else take care of that. Procurement was really not just acting on their behalf, but saying, hey, yeah, we have a whole slew of service providers, and we have technology tools, and hey, IT's got some cool tools. You can automate this, a little RPA, et cetera, but really trying to bring a wide, portfolio of services and capabilities to the stakeholders to be like, yeah, you want to get rid of that problem? Here's kind of your options. You can actually, do some of that. And what's actually funny is that some of that basically can create more spend under management by shifting from kind of, internal resources to external. But you always do this, hand in hand with the business. You never want to go into the business, hey, I'm here to outsource your work, right? That's right. Just not a good engagement, strategy. But being able to work with them and integrate into their processes, but also their tools. So like for IT, tying into their IT service management and help desk tools for shared services, could be talent management tools for HR, could be, we mentioned some of the treasury or budgeting tools with finance, could be agency management with marketing, obviously on the supply chain side, kind of supply planning or logistics, all these things, right? The more in which you can engage with these functions in terms of just their language, their processes, their tools, their objectives, right? Then you know how to bring value with good supply management processes, whether you do them or the business does it or a third party does it. That's the whole piece around operating models, right? And how do you bring the best model and resources to bear and do so kind of clinically, right? Without versus, hey, you just need to kind of come through me because I'm going to force myself to have influence into this. And sometimes you do that and you don't really have even enough to add, and you're too busy to really add enough value. So that's just the worst thing that you can do, is kind of try to mandate influence, and then you're unable to really support them. So this is where you want to start with where are the pain points, you engage with them in the way that on their turf, and then based on what they're trying to do, you bring in the best practice processes and tools and intelligence and suppliers that can help with that. And if you do that, the light goes off of, hey, procurement's here to actually make my life easier and bring in suppliers more intelligently versus how do I just, bang on existing suppliers for less money and get some savings credit, to hit their targets. That is the inflection point, right, that you're looking for. So that's
Yes.
the big picture view.
So a lesson is like what I've heard: never let a crisis go to waste. A downturn could be a very good time to do some very good soul searching and assessing what you've got, and maybe this is the perfect time to make a change. And procurement people should be ready to step in there and do that in a positive way. So
yeah,
good lesson.
absolutely, for the stakeholders and for themselves, for their own models in which how they engage the business, right? I mean, just not to go off on a sidetrack here, but like this whole thing around net promoter scores and internal stakeholder satisfaction kind of scoring and reviews, and almost viewing procurement as a service provider, that feels kind of inherently uncomfortable, right? For a lot of CPOs who are like, I'm not a low level service provider, shared services, white glove treatment. I'm here to do strategic supply chain, which is true, right? You're there to do that. But at the same time, if folks are not, they are not adopting, kind of the best practices and tools and the things that you're pushing, it's much easier to pull a string than push it, right? And so that ability to work with the stakeholders to kind of have them really kind of demand pull, just like in the supply chain for procurement's, value add, kind of help make you focus on, my user experience that I'm presenting to the business as procurement is kind of not so good, and the procurement's not alone, right? Legal, others, not always the free, a customer delight experience, if you will. So that's why there's a lot of CPOs focusing on user experience right now to make sure that they understand how to engage in procurement, the tools that are used, basically all this stuff, so that it's not just some black hole. It's transparent and it's clear, and they can therefore adopt it and get value. So get rid of those barriers, get rid of the friction.
Excellent. So here is a really sticky one that came up in the poll, and it's: what do you do to keep your ESG, your corporate social responsibility targets?
Yeah.
The world, consumers, the NGOs, governments, and just everyday people are demanding, and employees. People want to work for companies that are going green or are doing ethical practices or just saving the planet in one way or another, or at least not making it worse.
Yeah.
So, but that's easy when you're making money and when everything is going well, but now maybe not so much. So how do we keep our ESG goals intact and our initiatives intact when we're in a downturn and everything gets tighter?
Well, it's really funny, isn't it? I mean, it's like I've been doing kind of procurement research and advisory for 20 years. I used to actually be in the supply chain, then I got into this whole kind of tech, research and advisory area. And it's funny how the studies, like when business, when times are generally better, you tend to find that we start to focus on things beyond cost savings and cash and things like that. And we start to focus on these other things, right? And then it's like, as soon as, recession hits again or whatever, it's like that all goes out the window. I think what's different though this time is, first of all,